Hello everyone, welcome to SwitchUp. Today we've got a review for you of Man of Medan. This is part of the Dark Pictures Anthology. It's the first, in fact, of that particular series, and it released on the Switch without much fanfare actually quite recently.
Yeah, it's another shadow drop on the Switch, so we'll start off by looking at the performance before we go on to the full review features.
So what exactly is Man of Medan? Well, let's find out.
Okay, on the subject of performance then, well, it's rather controversially running at 24 frames per second. Now, I would say in this style of game, 24 FPS, which matches a traditional cinema screen, actually was quite a smart decision. I know you said, Glenn, that the game originally ran quite badly on the PlayStation.
Yeah, it was a game that the PS4, which is where I first played it many times actually for the full trophy list, and it did chug on there, to be fair. The whole series actually does struggle on the PS4, so I was very intrigued to see how it would hold up on the Switch. And to be fair, I don't think it certainly doesn't run any worse than on the PS4, that's for sure.
Yeah, so 24 FPS is its target and it seems to be locked out almost all of the time. What you think of that will really determine your experience, I guess. There'll be some people that say that 30 is the bare minimum for any game really, but in this style, as we say, it does work. But the problem I have is that there are a few drops. Now you will see a couple of stutters here and there. It's not bad enough that it becomes a talking point, I guess, but it is worth us mentioning, and you may see it on some of the frame rate footage. Now it looks to be using FSR upscaling from what I can see, so we have what looks like a native image, but you'll also see some strange artifacting around the edges of certain objects. But then at the same time, particularly static items within the world have nice sharp edges and look like they're rendered natively. As it runs on the Unreal Engine, we know we're going to have some sort of texture streaming issues. It's always the way. You see textures load in at certain times. There's one particular scene where we were playing and it was looking at a newspaper or something similar, and you could see suddenly the texture appeared on screen.
Yeah, now this is something that happened in the PS4 version as well. I would say the one area, having played the two, where the Switch maybe does fall down slightly is that those textures did take a bit longer to render, but we're still talking about seconds. But you will notice it often because you will be picking up a lot of items and the camera will zoom in on those items at those times.
Yeah, by its very nature, it's one of those where you're intently looking at every scene, every expression, every moment, so you really do notice any technical things like that. Now, shadows with FSR are also another area where you can see some slight degradation. They get almost like a crosshatch effect in some of them. But I will say, overall, I think they're actually quite impressive. You see the narrator at times and his shadows cast onto the books on the shelf. Although the textures on those books isn't particularly impressive, the skin tones and textures, the things that matter that you'll be staring at a lot, look reasonable.
Yeah, I would say so, absolutely.
Now, audio quality across the board seems quite impressive. There doesn't seem to be any downsampling. And as you'd expect, it's all famous voice actors.
Yeah, I think the most famous of the actors would probably be Shawn Ashmore, who, I mean, I know best as Iceman in the X-Men film from many years ago. But everyone that is in the game, you know, does play their part. The voice acting is of a good standard, as you would hope and expect. And it definitely, in this sort of game, is, you know, a major positive to have that good voice acting.
Let me reassure you, you help them to make some decisions they'll value later on. You're doing well.
Right, we're going to move on to the game itself now. We appreciate that some people may have played this game before. It has been out a while, so we wanted to do the technical stuff first. But moving on to the game, it is, of course, a third-person adventure game with a horror element in terms of its story. So just to touch on that story, I won't go too far into it. I don't want to give too much away. But you basically follow 5 friends. You have Alex and his brother Brad. You have his girlfriend Julia and her brother Conrad, and you have Fliss, who is the captain of the boat that they have hired to go and do some deep-sea diving. Whilst out doing the diving, they find the coordinates to some Manchurian gold, as it's called, and after finding themselves kidnapped by a gang of fishermen, they end up at the location of the coordinates, which turns out to be some sort of ghost ship.
Yeah, it looks to be based on the urban legend about the SS Orang Medan, which was basically I think it was a Dutch trading ship that was found without any of the crew alive, and they didn't exactly know what was happening, and when they went to investigate, the whole thing exploded.
So in terms of the gameplay then, as I said, it is a third-person adventure game. You'll be walking around the environment. Very cutscene heavy as well, though, as you would expect. It is very much a narrative tale, but you will be picking up items at times. A lot of these are just to fill in some of the blanks of the narrative, but there will also be times where you're picking up items that will help you. And every decision that you make will have an impact. It genuinely does affect the story. There'll be lots of times where you'll need to converse with other characters, and then what will happen is you'll have a small moment where you can decide on your answer by pressing the right stick in the direction of one of the choices. And all of these are assigned either a head or a heart. So obviously you're either making a decision with your head or your heart. And again, this does change the way that the story goes.
So you said there that those are time-based decisions. Is that in the same way as something like a Telltale Games, where you have a very limited period of time before you have to make your choice?
It is, and this is quite interesting actually, because this game offers a huge amount of accessibility in terms of what you can do with that. So if you just play it as is, as per the default settings, you have limited time to answer. Any combat that you get into, again, you'll have a small window to make the move and move the cursor where it needs to be. And the QuickTime events, of which there are plenty, will involve all 4 buttons, A, B, X and Y, of course. But you can go into the options and you can really scale that back. So you can have QuickTime events just be one button. I think it's A, might be B, I'm not sure now. But it will only ever be that one button. And you can also turn off the windows of time, so you have unlimited time to make the decision. Obviously, if you still make the wrong decision, there's going to be a consequence, but it does make the game much easier if you don't like QuickTime events, but you do want to see the story.
So in terms of controls and moving around the world, does it use a Resident Evil style tank control system?
It does, very much so. So you will move, there will be fixed camera perspectives, and these will change as you go onto each scene. Just to touch on the controls very quickly, they are very archaic. The characters have this very weird inertia about them where it almost takes them time to move. So you'll press the stick forward and it takes them, it's almost like a motor on a car, having to warm up for a minute before you start moving. I think this was fixed for later games in this series, and I'm surprised they haven't gone back and changed this for the first game, because they have actually gone back and added a lot of those aforementioned accessibility features that weren't in this first game originally but appeared in the later games. One thing actually that did seem improved on that note was the heartbeat sections. So sometimes you will have to hide and there will be someone obviously nearby that you need to stay out of the way of, but your heartbeat will be going on screen and you'll need to time your button presses to your heartbeat, and if you mess up obviously they'll find you. In this first game on the PS4, these seemed very erratic. At times you'd swear blind that you pressed them right and they wouldn't register. Everything else was fine, but just that one element, they seem much better in this Switch version.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning as well on that note, and I didn't mention in performance because it specifically affects the gameplay. It's like you just said there is an audio sync issue that remains in this version, so that certain events, like you've just said, where you're having to time it to the lightning that's happening in the background, it's out of sync essentially, isn't it?
It can be at times, yes, so you'll just have to know that as you play, because otherwise it might hinder you when you need to time something right. Just moving on to some of the other elements of the gameplay, and one of them are the photo frames, or the pictures that you'll find. Now within the game world there are 12 different photos that you can find, 6 with a white frame and 6 with a black frame. If you find these, they will show you part of the future. The white frames show you a premonition of what could be if you do things right, and the black frames will show you a death of one of the characters. All of the characters can die as you play this game, based of course on your choices, and that will affect your ending. If you use these, you can then make the correct choices when you get to that particular scene. They are very obscure, they're not going to hold your hand, but it's a very clever way of showing you what could be, you know?
Although the game is only a handful of hours long, I think the focus here is on playthroughs, isn't it? So multiple playthroughs.
It is very much so. Now, as I said, obviously, I've played it on the PS4. I've played it through maybe 5-6 times. As I said, I got all of the trophies. Now, one thing I will say, it depends, I suppose, on your mindset, because I'm not a huge trophy hunter, but these sort of games I do feel compelled to get the trophies for, and obviously on the Switch that won't be a part of it. So if you are wanting to play through it over and over again, you will get a very different experience for the most part, certainly in terms of the endings, but there won't be any reward, if you like, you know, so it's just something to bear in mind. Another thing I will say that's a bit of a negative, because of that repetitive gameplay loop of replaying, you can't ever skip any of the scenes, which is a massive negative, because when you've played it through 4 times and you're trying to see that final ending and you're having to, you know, watch a scene you've seen so many times by this point, it does start to grate. Thankfully there is a chapter select, so that's something, but of course you'll need to go back to a chapter where your choices are as you want them to be to get the ending that you're looking for, if that makes sense. Obviously if you've done something since that takes you off on a different path, you'll have to go back further to eradicate that and move forward again.
Yeah, really unusual decision there, to be honest, in this style of game.
This is the updated version, so as I mentioned, the accessibility features have been added, but it also adds in the curator's cut. The narrator that Marc mentioned earlier, his name is the Curator. He's fantastic, actually. He pops up every so often just to kind of give you some words on your performance so far in terms of how you've gone about your story. And the Curator's cuts, I believe, were pre-order bonuses on the PS4 versions, and then everyone else could download them like 6 months later for free. But this does include that, and it adds some scenes that are completely different. And you'll see a scene that you played before from one character's perspective, because you do play as different characters as you go along, from one of the other characters' points of view, which is a nice little touch.
Now there is a multiplayer mode in here, and I think it's important to explain how that works.
Yes, so multiplayer is quite an interesting one. Now I must say I've never played it online. It's available online or in local, so I can't say much for how online works, but in terms of the local mode, what happens is you will be assigned characters each between you and your partner, and then when that character is on screen, it's their turn to control it. So you still only need one controller, but the point of it is meant to be that you then make the decisions solely for that character. So as a two, you're kind of locked into what the other person wants to do. Now, I played all of these games through with my wife, and we've discussed the decisions. You know, even when we played in multiplayer, we still discussed it. So obviously we didn't have that kind of that angle of having to stick by someone else's set of morals, if you like. But it is quite an interesting way to play it.
It would make a very interesting party game. So you can actually do up to 5-player co-op. Like Glen says, each get assigned a player, don't discuss your decisions, and then play through that way.
It is quite interesting how the decisions work, because sometimes the decision you make way early into the game can have an outcome many hours later. Now this can be quite frustrating because obviously you're locked into these decisions, but it does really make you think about literally every decision. You know, whether to pick up the knife that's on the floor, which of the two items that are available you should take with you, whether you should convince a character to do something or try to convince them not to. Everything will have, you know, quite a big impact on the story overall, and the story is very well told.
The game's launched at £17.99, and it's going to take up about 11.7 gigabytes on your Switch.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I was actually quite surprised, pleasantly so, at that price. I did expect it to be about £30, not because I think it should be, just because that seems to be standard practice for games that are released on Switch years after having released elsewhere. For that money, I mean, one playthrough would probably take about 5 hours, I would say, but as Marc said earlier, this is all about playing it through multiple times, making different decisions, and getting different endings. If you do everything the game wants you to do, there's collectibles to find as well. You're probably looking at 20 hours, I would say. That's probably what I put into it on the PS4, but there is that slight downside of having, you know, no trophies or achievements to strive towards. So if you are someone that needs that, you're not going to find it in this version.
First place. It's bad luck. You think you can scavenge down there and it makes no difference, but every single thing you bring back has an essence. It's like a ghost you invite to the surface.
So with all that said then, Man of Medan gets a SwitchUp score of 73%. I like the fact that this has released on the Switch. I'm very pleasantly surprised as to how it runs. It's not fantastic, but it's certainly no worse than the PS4 version that I played, and it'll be interesting to see if we get the other 3 games already out in the series, and there is a 5th game in the works too.
Yeah, anytime we don't get a cloud version, I'm a happy man.
A big thank you to our patrons, as always, for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.